The night the rain turned sideways over Vancouver was the same night. Rowan Mercer decided that 3 years of marriage had been enough of an inconvenience. Isla Brennan stood in his corner office on the 28th floor, the city blurring through the floor-to-ceiling glass behind him, the divorce papers already spread across his desk like a verdict he had rehearsed for weeks. He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. Men like Rowan never needed to. He simply pointed at the signature line with one finger and looked at her the way he might look at a vendor who had delivered the wrong order. "It's not complicated, Isla, sign it." She had found out she was pregnant that same morning. The test was still in her coat pocket, folded inside a gas station receipt, the 2 lines still vivid behind her eyes every time she blinked. She had spent the whole afternoon rehearsing how to tell him. Gently, carefully, watching his face for the softness she had married him believing was there somewhere underneath the ambition. But Rowan's phone had lit up before she could begin. A message from Tessa Fontaine glowing on the screen, and whatever courage she had assembled fell apart quietly, the way buildings do in slow motion before anyone realizes what's happening. "I need you to understand something first," Isla started. "There's nothing to understand." He slid the pen across the mahogany toward her. "We've been over for a long time. The only person who hasn't accepted that is you." She looked at the pen. She looked at the city behind him, all of Vancouver glittering in the rain like something that had never belonged to her. She had helped build the company that paid for that view. Not publicly, not with her name anywhere visible, but in the early years when Rowan was still pitching Mercer Group's energy software platform to anyone who would sit still long enough to listen. It was Isla who had spent months working through the underlying system architecture with him at the kitchen table, long after he'd gone to sleep, until the logic finally held together. She had never asked for credit. She had believed, with the particular foolishness of a woman who grew up with nothing and had learned to find safety in being useful, that what was his was theirs. She signed the papers. The walk to the parkade was the longest of her life. The elevator doors closed, and she pressed her back against the cold concrete of the parking level and let her knees give out. Not gently. Her whole body simply stopped holding itself up, and the sound she made into the damp underground air was not a sound she recognized as hers. She pressed both palms flat against the ground and felt her breath come in waves she couldn't control, and her hand moved on its own to her stomach. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Please, just stay." A car passed without slowing. A couple stepped from the elevator, laughing, saw her and looked carefully away. Her phone buzzed. A message from Rowan. "Don't contact me after tonight. We're done." She sat on the cold concrete until she couldn't feel her hands anymore. There was no one to call. She had grown up in a series of foster placements in the interior. Kamloops, then Kelowna, then a group home in Penticton she didn't talk about, and the people she was closest to now were colleagues who had always assumed her position at Mercer Group was a result of her marriage and not, as was actually the case, in spite of it. Her credentials in structural engineering had placed her in the top percentile of the province before she'd ever heard Rowan Mercer's name. Quiet competence, she had learned, is invisible to people looking for someone to credit. She drove herself home. She sat on the bathroom floor of the small condo she had kept in her own name throughout the marriage. Some instinct she had never been able to fully explain, even to herself, and stared at the pregnancy test until the light outside the window changed from black to gray. She wasn't just heartbroken, she was terrified. And she was going to have to learn how to carry both of those things at once, with no map and no help, because that was apparently who she had always been when everything else was stripped away. By the end of the week, she was at Pearson Airport in Toronto with 2 bags, a thermos of tea that had gone cold somewhere over the prairies, and no plan beyond needing to be somewhere that Rowan's shadow didn't reach. Toronto in November is not a gentle city. The wind off the lake finds every gap in your clothing, and the sky has that particular deep gray quality of a place that has seen too much to be surprised by anything. She found a sublet in the annex. 2nd floor of a Victorian row house, with a radiator that clanked all night and a landlord who asked no questions. And she spent the first 3 days doing almost nothing except walking to the nearest coffee shop and back, as if forward motion itself might constitute a plan. She was not yet visibly pregnant. The fear of losing the baby, or babies, though she didn't know that yet, was a constant low hum beneath everything. A sound she had learned to live inside after 2 earlier losses, that Rowan had met with tight-lipped discomfort, and the suggestion that she was making it harder than it had to be. She had never stopped blaming herself for those losses, because he had never stopped implying she should. On the 4th day, she walked down to Harbourfront, because she needed water. Lake Ontario in November looks like a decision that hasn't been made yet. Vast and pewter-colored and vaguely threatening, more like an inland sea, caught between becoming something and giving up. She sat on a bench near the boardwalk, with her hands folded in her lap, and watched a solitary gull work its way across the sky. She didn't notice Matthias Wolff until he had been standing a few meters away for several minutes. He was tall, in a dark wool coat that looked like it had seen some weather, and he was watching the lake with a stillness that seemed out of place in someone who, she would eventually understand, was rarely still by nature. He wasn't looking at her, but he noticed her. The way she held her shoulders, braced against something that wasn't wind. The red still edging her eyes. He recognized it, the posture of someone surviving a thing they hadn't chosen. He didn't approach. He simply stayed near the water long enough that she became aware of him, and then he was gone, and she walked home thinking nothing particular of it. Back in Vancouver, Rowan was not hiding his happiness. He and Tessa Fontaine attended 4 events in 10 days. A charity auction in Yaletown, a product launch in Gastown, a dinner photographed in West Vancouver, and a rooftop gathering in Cole Harbour that Tessa documented from 7 separate angles on her public accounts. In every photograph, Rowan's hand was on the small of her back, in the deliberate way of a man who wants the world to confirm what he has acquired. Tessa smiled with her whole face except her eyes, which were doing a quieter and more focused kind of mathematics than Rowan had yet thought to wonder about. The engagement announcement came on a Thursday morning, pushed through a publicist Isla hadn't known Rowan employed. She heard it on the radio in her Toronto kitchen, halfway through scrambling eggs she no longer wanted. Vancouver tech CEO Rowan Mercer has announced his engagement to lifestyle personality Tessa Fontaine. Mercer, founder and CEO of Mercer Group Energy Systems, described Fontaine as the real thing. The couple is expected to marry in the spring. The eggs burned. Isla stood at the stove with the element still on and stared at the wall until the smoke alarm beeped twice and brought her back into the room. She turned off the heat. She scraped the pan into the bin. She sat down on the kitchen floor, not collapsed, but a deliberate lowering, a decision her body made before her mind authorized it, and pressed her forehead to her knees. The real thing. After 3 years of making herself smaller so he could occupy more space. After the miscarriages he had treated as inconvenient delays. After the industry dinners where he called her his partner in the way that meant decoration, and the mornings he looked at her as if puzzled by her continued presence in his home. After all of it, she was the warm-up act, and Tessa Fontaine was the headline. She was still on the kitchen floor when the knock came. She almost didn't answer, but it came again, unhurried, not demanding, and a voice said through the door, "Isla, my name is Matthias Wolff. We crossed paths at the harbor last week. I saw the news this morning, and I wanted to make sure you were all right." She didn't know how he had her name. She didn't know how he had found her address. She was too stripped back to be properly afraid of it the way she might have been otherwise. She opened the door. He was the man from the boardwalk. Up close, he had the face of someone who had been in a few rooms where things went badly and had learned not to show it on the surface. His expression was not pity. She would have closed the door on pity, but something quieter and more careful than that. He was holding a paper bag from a bakery on Bloor. "I'm not great with visitors," she said. "I know," he held out the bag. "I'm not staying." She let him in anyway. He was as good as his word. He sat at her small kitchen table while she stood at the counter, and he told her plainly that he knew who she was, because he had been watching Mercer Group's trajectory for years, and that when he had seen her at the harbor, he had recognized in her face something he had seen before, in people carrying more than their share. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. "How does someone move through something like this?" she said. She wasn't entirely sure she was asking him. "By stopping pretending the weight isn't there," he said. "That's usually where people start." She didn't cry until after he left. But it was different from the crying in the parkade, less like drowning, more like a window someone had finally opened. He came back the next afternoon, and the afternoon after that. He never announced himself as someone significant, and she didn't look him up until his third visit, at which point she discovered that Matthias Wolff was the founding partner of Wolff Capital, one of the larger independent investment funds in the country, with holdings that made Rowan Mercer's operation look like a departmental line item. She sat with this information for a while and said nothing about it, because he clearly preferred it that way, and she had learned enough about men with power to understand that the ones who don't perform it are occasionally worth trusting. What she didn't know yet was that Rowan's Mercer Group had 4 years earlier quietly absorbed a licensing arrangement that had originally been structured to include Wolff Capital as a development partner. Rowan had engineered the exclusion through an amendment buried on page 41 of a revised contract, and the resulting loss had cost Matthias's fund a return it never recovered. Matthias had not forgotten. He had watched Rowan Mercer with the patient, settled attention of a man waiting for the weight of someone's choices to catch up with them. He had not manufactured what came next. He had simply refused to look away. The call from Quinn Beauregard came on a Tuesday, when Isla was sitting with a book she couldn't concentrate on and toast she wasn't eating. Quinn had been her lawyer through the divorce. Technically, though the process had moved so fast it had felt less like a legal proceeding and more like an eviction, and Quinn had carried a quiet unease about it ever since. "I'd been going back through the file," Quinn said. "Something kept pulling at me." Isla set down the book. "Do you remember working through the architecture on the Meridian platform? Early in Rowan's company, around 2019-2020? Something moved through Isla's chest. "I remember. There was a patent filed in 2021, the foundational architecture for Meridian. Rowan is the primary inventor of record. But the original filing lists 2 contributing designers because his patent lawyer at the time insisted on accuracy. One was his former technical lead, who left the company years ago." Quinn paused. "The other is identified by initials, IB, and a signed contribution declaration dated March 2021, which you appear to have signed along with a stack of company documents Rowan put in front of you that spring." The toast sat forgotten. "What does that mean?" "It means you have co-inventor standing on the patent that Mercer Group's entire flagship product depends on. His lawyers missed it when they drafted the divorce agreement because they were moving quickly and they assumed you had no foothold in the company's IP. Rowan missed it because he never imagined you'd look." Quinn's voice was steady and careful. "And there's more. Section 14 of the agreement he signed, it includes a standard commercialization waiver. Given your co-inventor status, the way that clause was drafted means he has effectively waived his right to pursue exclusive commercialization of the Meridian IP without your written consent." The room was very quiet around Isla. "He can't commercialize his own product," she said slowly, "without my approval. Not under the current agreement. Not without a court challenge he would in all probability lose, given the documentation trail." A pause. "Isla, you didn't know any of this when you signed. He didn't believe you'd ever know. But now that you do, he's going to come after you hard when he finds out. He'll say it was oversight. He'll throw resources at it. He'll try to make it go away." "And can he?" "Not easily. Because the documentation is his lawyer's filing, his signature on the waiver, his rush to push you out the door without checking what he was putting in front of you." Quinn paused. "You never wanted to harm him. I understand that. But peace requires that he stops having power over you, and right now, for the first time, you're the one holding the real leverage. You just didn't know you had it." Isla pressed her free hand flat against her abdomen, against the 2 lives she had been quietly praying through every scan for months, and she felt something settle inside her. Not triumph. Not revenge. Something older and sturdier than either of those things. The quiet recognition that she had always been standing on ground she had helped build, and that no one had ever thought to tell her. She told Matthias that evening, not because she had decided entirely to trust him, though she was moving in that direction, carefully, the way you move toward warmth when you've been cold too long. But because he was the only person in this city who knew her name, and she needed to say it out loud. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "I knew about the Meridian patent. I didn't know you were on it." She looked at him steadily. "You knew about Rowan?" "Yes." He didn't look away. "For years. I've watched what he built and what he took credit for and who he discarded along the way. You weren't the first person he removed from his own story." A pause. "But I think you might be the last." "Did you do anything to cause this?" "No," he said. "Your lawyer found it because she has a conscience, and she was doing her job properly. I didn't arrange anything. I just didn't walk away from the harbor when I saw you sitting there." He leaned forward slightly. "I recognized the shape of someone who'd been made to feel invisible. It made me angry. It still does." She believed him. She wasn't entirely sure why, except that men who want to impress you don't tend to sit on your kitchen floor, eating soup from a thermos and saying very little. Men who want something from you don't give you time the way Matthias gave her time, unhurried, without condition, without expecting her to account for it. The girls arrived early, which surprised no one who had been paying attention, because everything about Isla's life had been off schedule for the better part of a year. It was a Sunday morning in February, and she woke to contractions that had moved past the manageable stage, sometime around 3 in the morning. She called Matthias before she called anyone else, because he was the name in her phone that she trusted, and he answered before the second ring. He was at her door in 11 minutes. He stayed through the ambulance and the triage, and the long grinding hours that felt both endless and terrifyingly compressed. And when the neonatal team placed 2 small and furious girls against her chest in quick succession, one, and then, before she had fully caught her breath, another, the sound he made standing beside her was not a man performing presence. It was the sound of someone genuinely quietly, moved by a good thing happening in a room that had seen too many difficult ones. 2 girls, the nurse said, both breathing strong. Isla laughed through tears so thick she could barely see. She had bargained for this. She had pressed her hands against her stomach in parking garages and airports and small Toronto apartments and begged for exactly this. And here they were. 2 small people with their fists already clenched and their eyes already squinting against the light, already working out how to be alive. "You're extraordinary," Matthias said, low and unsteady. She didn't have words. She just held on. The photographs appeared online within hours. A hospital visitor, no one ever determined who, had captured Matthias carrying Isla through the corridor in the early morning, her head against his shoulder, her face exhausted and unguarded. The image moved through the internet the way images of real things always do, faster and further than intended. By noon, the guessing had reached a velocity that neither of them was ready for. By evening, it had reached Rowan Mercer in Vancouver, where he was in the middle of a presentation he subsequently could not have described to anyone. Quinn called Isla that afternoon. "He's on a red-eye, lands in about 4 hours. He has no standing here," Isla said. "He doesn't know that yet." Matthias arranged additional security for the ward. He also made a quiet call to the senior partner at Rowan's corporate firm, the one who had drafted the Section 14 clause, and left a message that anyone with experience would have understood as a warning, delivered in the most civil possible register. Rowan arrived at 11 o'clock at night. He had not changed. He had not slept. The photographers outside, there were several by then, got pictures of a man who looked nothing like the polished executive that business profiles had been assembling for years. He looked like someone who had finally understood that he had made a mistake that money could not reframe. Matthias was waiting in the corridor outside the neonatal ward. "Move," Rowan said. "No," Matthias said. "You have no business here." "And you," Matthias said, "have already forfeited yours." He held out the envelope. "Before you take another step, read Section 14 of your own divorce agreement. Then read the co-inventor declaration your patent lawyer filed in 2021. Then decide whether you want your next move to happen in a hospital corridor or in federal IP court." Rowan snatched the envelope. He read fast and understood slower, and Isla, watching from the doorway of her room, where she had insisted on standing despite the nurse's firm suggestions otherwise, could see the exact moment the full meaning arrived in him. His jaw set. The color left his face. His hand gripped the envelope the way a person grips something when they need evidence of how much they've lost. "She set me up," he said, very quietly. "She signed exactly what you put in front of her," Matthias said. "The same way she always did. The difference is that this time you were moving so fast to get rid of her that you didn't check what was in the stack. I'm their father. You waived that claim before they existed. Not loud, not theatrical, simply true. And if you come back here, to this ward, to her home, anywhere near those children, you'll discover there are consequences available to me that go well beyond family court." Rowan stood in the corridor for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the elevator, and Isla watched him go and exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. What happened to Mercer Group in the weeks that followed was not swift, but it was thorough in the way of things built on a compromised foundation. Once Quinn filed the formal IP position, the uncertainty it created around the Meridian platform was exactly the kind of uncertainty that institutional investors cannot hold. The expansion deal, Rowan's flagship ambition, the one he had staked the company's next decade on, was suspended pending resolution. Federal IP review proceedings were opened. The board met and voted to suspend his executive authority while the investigation ran its course. Tessa Fontaine's lifestyle brand dropped its primary sponsor within 48 hours of the story reaching national media. Her engagement announcement disappeared from her public accounts 11 days after the hospital, replaced by a brief statement wishing everyone involved well. Nobody was surprised because everyone who had been paying attention had seen it coming, and the people who hadn't been paying attention had still managed to understand it by the second day of headlines. Rowan gave a statement outside Mercer Group headquarters that was precise and controlled and contained. For anyone reading carefully, not a single word of genuine remorse. He described the IP dispute as a procedural matter under legal review. He described his divorce from Isla as private. He said he wished his former wife the best. He did not mention his daughters. Isla did not hold a press conference. Quinn released a written statement on her behalf, 3 paragraphs long, which said in careful measured language that Isla Brennan stood by her legal position, that her daughters were healthy and safe, and that she had never sought to cause harm, only to be left in peace. The statement ended, "The most powerful thing I ever learned to do is stand still and let the truth arrive on its own schedule." Every major Canadian outlet had it by noon. Several American and British ones had it by the following morning. The girls, named Willa and Fern, names Isla had written in her notebook months before they arrived, grew the way fighters always grow, stubborn and steady and more themselves with every passing week. Isla kept a journal by the bassinet, where she wrote the things she wanted to tell them eventually. What it had cost her to get to this room, what she had learned about the difference between being loved and being useful to someone, what it felt like to discover that her name had been on something important all along, and that the only person who had kept it hidden was the one person who should have made sure the whole world knew. Matthias did not announce himself as anything. He continued to show up. Groceries when she was exhausted. A quiet hour on the couch when she needed someone nearby who didn't require her to perform okayness for their comfort. He brought soup once and spent 40 minutes on the floor, trying to assemble a second-hand baby swing he had tracked down from a shop on Bloor Street, with the instruction manual spread across the hardwood and one bracket that refused to cooperate. And the sight of him, cross-legged and entirely focused on the problem, was so ordinary and so far from every version of wealth and power she had imagined that she laughed until she had to press her face into a sofa cushion. One evening in late March, when the Toronto light had that particular tentative quality of a Canadian spring that is still mostly winter but making an effort, Isla sat in the window of the apartment with Willa asleep against her chest and Fern in the bassinet. Matthias sat across from her with a cup of tea gone cold in his hand. Neither of them said anything for a while, and the quiet was easy in the way that quiet is only easy when you've stopped performing for each other. "You should know," he said eventually, "that I'm not going anywhere, not unless you want me to." She looked at him and didn't look away. I'm not ready for anything with a name yet, she said. It was the most honest thing she had said to another person in years. I know, he said. I'm not asking for a name. I'm just telling you I'll be here for the unnamed version for as long as you need it. Willa shifted against her, some dream or hunger moving through those small sleeping limbs. And outside, the city settled into its evening. A streetcar in the middle distance. Someone's music drifting up from a floor below. The ordinary sounds of a building full of people living their lives without any idea what the woman on the second floor had survived to arrive here. Isla Brennan looked at her daughter's sleeping face, and at the man across from her who had never once asked her to be smaller, and she felt the thing inside her. The scaffolding, the structure beneath hope, the architecture she had been quietly building through all the worst months. Hold firm and steady. Not every ending is loud. Some of the most important ones happen in a quiet room, in early spring light, with two daughters breathing softly, and the long-settled knowledge that you are finally, irrevocably, somewhere safe. And if you've been with this story all the way to this moment, then something in Isla's journey found the part of you that knows what it costs to stay standing when someone who should have believed in you chose not to. Epictetus wrote that no one can make you feel inferior without your consent. Not because the pain isn't real, but because the meaning you make from it belongs entirely to you. Isla didn't stop being who she was. She was just given the distance, and the quiet, and eventually the evidence, to remember it. If you're carrying something heavy today, I hope her story helps carry a little of it for you. Like this video if it stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Mr. Charles Stories so we can keep walking through these together. You're not as alone as it feels right now. You never were.